Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is my great pleasure to welcome Mark Lavoie from Stanford University to come talk to us about some of his work. As probably most of you know, Mark is a real luminary in the computer graphics field. He was one of the inventors of volume rendering. He was one of the co-inventors of the field of image-based rendering. Became very well known for his large-scale range scanning with the Michelangelo project in Florence, and has since gone on to nucleate other fields, including computational photography, and in which I think some of his most recent work that I'm very personally excited about is the Frankencamera project that builds intelligent cameras that people can program, including cell phone cameras. And today, Mark would like to talk about some even more recent ideas on sports photography and what makes it difficult. So welcome, Mark.
Thank you, Rick. So thank you for all for coming. I'm particularly impressed that Hughes Hopi is here, because the reason I'm in Seattle is because of the SIGGRAPH Program Committee meeting, and he should have his hands too full to attend a talk like this. Okay. So what I'm going to talk about today is a hobby that I took on for about a year, doing sports photography, to see whether we could do anything in computational photography to help. And if you have to leave in the next 5 minutes, the executive summary is that it's very hard. And I will spend the rest of the talk defending that claim. But let me start by sort of setting the context by talking just a little bit about computational photography in general as I see it. So the megapixel wars are ending. It seems that computational photography is poised to be one of the main competitive edges that cameras and especially mobile platforms will compete over for the next 5 or 10 years. And one of the reasons that this is so is if you look at a plot of the number of megapixels, and you could even say that it's tailing off, and the compute power on these mobile platforms, and I've used the texture fill rate on a graphics card as an example of that, they're at different slopes. And the steeper slope of the computational power opens some headroom, and that headroom allows you to do more computation per pixel. So you can use this one of two ways. Either you can do more complicated algorithms, or you can do the same algorithms with less hardware, or in a more programmable way. And I think both of those will happen, and we'll take advantage of those. So how are these new computational features going to appear to consumers? They could be standard and invisible, and so high dynamic range imaging might be an example of that, or better metering algorithms. They could be standard and disableable. Maybe high dynamic range imaging will go there, where you can turn it on or off like you can on the iPhone, for example. What I'm most excited about is the idea of aftermarket plugins and apps for your camera. So you're probably thinking to yourself, yeah, sure, like the scene modes that are on my camera that no one uses. Well, I don't think we should take what's currently happening with scene modes as an example. And let me just show you as sort of an argument along there. This is the Casio EX-F1. Some people say it's the first computational photography camera in the commercial marketplace. It has lots of different interesting scene modes, and you can find those scene modes listed in the manual, probably starting at about page 138. You get the idea. This is not the way to do it. So if I could even find the scene modes, it'll say, if it's a portrait at night, turn it to this mode. Why? It doesn't say why. It doesn't give you A-B comparisons. It's a horrible marketing job. No one uses those scene modes if they even know about them. I think what's going to happen is that the independent developers are going to get it right. Because if you look at the iPhone app market or Google Marketplace, they know how to take one small feature or one small functionality and position it and sell it and explain it in a way that consumers get it. And it's become a large marketplace. And at the risk of a little bit of self-aggrandizement, here's an app that I wrote. So I've played a little bit myself in this marketplace. Can we turn down these lights just a little bit? They're shining right on the screen and they're blowing out the images. Just those in particular.
Random buttons until the lights change in a way.
Okay, random buttons. That looks great. That's better, actually.
It's often very hard to see the speaker for the audience.
Yeah. No, that's too many. You had
Low response time of the buttons doesn't help.
All right, I'll let you play with it.
Is listening and actually understands these buttons.
No, but that actually, no. All right, I'll let you play with it. I'll keep going. All right, so, no, and now that's back on again. SynthCam is an app I wrote for the iPhone. And what it lets you do is wave around an iPhone, and the small pinhole of the camera becomes a large synthetic aperture like an SLR. You can place focus points like this. All right, so you can also hold it still and reduce the noise by the square root of the number of images. You can do tilt shift stuff. So my point here is, how did I market this? I created a website, which you're looking at right now, that said, here are the different things you can do with it. I explained in a long tutorial how to do each one. I created a bunch of YouTube videos that says, here's how you hold it and use it. If that were done for the seed modes in cameras, I think the story would have been entirely different. And I think that's what's going to happen with apps, or could happen with apps and plugins. All right, so let's get to the main theme of the talk, which is sports photography. So let me limit the domain. It's going to be just team sports on fields or in arenas, what's hard about them, and what computational photography can do to help. My creds here are only that I have apprenticed myself to professional sports photographers for a year at Stanford, and there I am with my baseball cap on backwards and a big camera. So what the talk is not about is, it's not going to be about special technical photography like the horse race finish photograph. It's not going to be about point and shoot cameras, because if you've ever tried to capture someone from figure skating, you know it's just really, really hard. That's what the moment camera is for. I see Michael in the audience. Non-sports action photographs are a little bit harder to generalize about, and so I'm just going to keep my domain narrow. We're not going to talk about videography, except that the burst rates that I'm talking about are getting pretty close to video rate. And I'm not talking about making every shot count. That's impossible in sports photography. I would be happy to change my success rate from 1 in 100 to 1 in 10. That would be a success. And I'm not talking about the once-in-a-lifetime shots, because you can't plan for those, or things like that. Okay, so why is this domain of sports photography hard? And the obvious answer is that sports move fast. The fields are big, the arenas are dark, you don't control stuff, and in fact you barely control the composition. And I'll talk about that. So what you do is put yourself in the right places by having a pass, and then you do what sports photographers call spray and pray. You take 2,000 pictures in a typical game, and then you need a very good post-processing workflow. I use Lightroom. There are other solutions. Aperture is another one. Lightroom is nice because you can label things every which way and process them quickly and sync across computers and so on. And the common tools are done well. So the 95% case is done nicely. So there are many ways of capturing motion in interesting ways. I'm not talking about panning kinds of shots. I won't be talking about special effects like strobing. All I'll be talking about is the typical sports view, which is freezing. This is one of my favorite dance photographs, or perhaps one of the best dance photographs of all time, by Lois Greenfield. So freezing is also the easiest thing for us to talk about. And what I will do then is talk about this kind of sports photography, teams, arenas, and I'll go through each of the photographic variables, and we'll see what's hard and what's easy. And so this is sort of an outline of the rest of the talk. All right, so let's just start right in. Shutter speed. So women's volleyball at Stanford, you can work out the required shutter speed just from the fraction of the field of view that's covered by the motion of the players per second. So let's do that. She's doing a spike. it's not frozen. There's motion blur there. So let's look closely at that. It's about 1 centimeter of blur in real space, and that's in an 800th of a second exposure. So that suggests she's moving her arm about 80 centimeters in a tenth of a second. And so here's a verification of that. These frames are a tenth of a second apart, and sure enough, you can see how much she's moved her arm. Okay, now we know the number of pixels in Canon 5D Mark II, and so she's moving her hand about 5,000 pixels per second. So we would need a 5,000th of a second to freeze her motion. That's really short. Not many photons. So sports photographers never shoot below 1,000 unless it's a poised moment before a gymnastics move or something like that. And for humans can do things that require more at typical viewing distances. So 2,000th of a second or even higher.
But Mark, does that speed suggest that you just have to be lucky to get the shot because there's no way for you to trigger?
We'll talk about that. Okay. All right, so while I've got this picture up here, what's that? Doesn't her arm look a little funny? What is it?
Is it rolling shutter?
Well, this is a still camera.
It's a still camera, so it shouldn't.
What is that? What is it? Focal plane shutter distortion. So the shutter is a small slit that moves. So it's just like a rolling shutter distortion. And her arm doesn't actually bend. It's typically not a problem. Very few of my shots are ruined because of focal plane shutter distortion, because the focal plane shutters move extremely fast on these professional cameras. But this one was ruined. Okay, so next variable, ISO, which is the analog gain that happens before it's converted to a digital number. So this was at ISO 3200. I should have been shooting at a 1600th of a second at ISO 6400. That's not actually that high in ISO these days. I'll come back and talk about noise in ISO in a little while. The only way to get around that in an indoor arena is to add light. And in fact, that's what some sports photographers do. You can control flashes in the arena ceiling in many places, including at Stanford's arenas. Not everybody can, but a few professional sports photographers can sign up for their little radio control to turn on the strobe lights. And there are limits about how frequently you can do that without annoying the athletes. I did not in any of my shots. This was grabbed off the internet. Okay, next variable, aperture. So you're fighting for every photon, especially in an arena, because you're shooting these short shutter times. So you're always, or almost always, wide open when you do sports photography. And that's what big glass means. You need a large aperture. Of course, the trade-off there is that sacrifices depth of field. So she's out of focus, even though I would have liked her to be in focus in this particular shot. So big glass means, especially if you're far away, that it's literally a large lens. So in this case, it's a 600 millimeter lens. It's about this big. F4, it's an $8,000 lens. And it's just really big and hard to hold.
Gloss over 12 pounds.
Notice this guy has, he's hand holding it, but he's got camouflage and a flannel shirt. I think he's probably just being macho here. If you want to hold this for an hour and a half during a sports game, you always have a monopod. Not a tripod, because you need to swing around too much, a monopod. And you also need to pick it up and run with it occasionally. So that's what sports photographers will typically use, as a monopod. Enough to just support the weight of the lens. All right, let's talk a little bit about megapixels and pixel size. So Canon 1D Mark III is one of these professional sports cameras. The pixels are fairly large, 7 by 7 microns. It's actually a modest number of megapixels, only 10 megapixels. But the pixels are big, which means less noise in low light. And that also permits fast readout because there aren't that many megapixels. So it's not as many pixels, for example, as Canon's full frame of the 5D Mark II, which is 6 by 6 microns, because they want just a little bit more light. And so it's what's called a 1.3x crop factor, whereas the full frame is 1.0 crop factor, and the typical APS-C cameras, like the D30, the D60, are 1.6x crop factors. So it's a very careful compromise between the size of pixels for noise and readout and having enough pixels. Let me just say one or two things about the user interface. These are complicated cameras. They're essentially like a fighter pilot control. Lots of analog stuff. No mode buttons that do 10 different things as you have typically found on point-and-shoot cameras. So it requires just a lot of practice to use this, especially in stressful situations. You're shooting always in RAW so that you can fiddle later, especially with white balance. In manual or aperture priority mode, where you set the aperture and it sets the shutter speed, you do have autofocus on, and we'll talk about autofocus. You have stabilization off, because at 1,000th of a second, there's no stabilization possible. The stabilization hardware doesn't run that fast. It's hard to change lenses, and so professionals will carry multiple bodies. You'll see them out there with bandoliers strung across their chest with two different camera bodies, complete with their lenses ready to go. And they seldom use zoom. There's no time to sit there and fiddle with a zoom during fast action, and zoom lenses, meaning a variable zoom, always have a smaller aperture, and that lets in less light. And the big glass is really important. Okay, this is interesting, that none of the professional cameras, and in fact not even down to point-and-shoot cameras, have a radio. Now this is beginning to change. This year we're beginning to see some point-and-shoot cameras that have radios. And they're plug-in Wi-Fi cards for some of the larger cameras, but it's not made by the companies who make the cameras. I remember a moment during the Stanford Cal big game last year where there was a decisive interception by Cal of the Stanford pass, and all the photographers who managed to capture that moment ran to the sidelines, sat down, plugged into their laptops, and started uploading it to their publisher, missing the rest of the action and all the celebration. That's crazy. Why can't there be a little viewfinder? You go back, find the right picture, upload to publisher, and meanwhile you continue shooting. I mean, that's just nuts. And I think part of that is because there is a cultural disconnect between the camera makers and the whole internet ecosystem. And that will either change or they'll be left behind, I predict, over the next 5 or 10 years. Okay, noise. So this is now indoors, 1,000th of a second, fairly high ISO, fully wide open with a lens. But it's not that bad after you've denoised it a little bit. Actually, Lightroom 2's denoising wasn't all that good, but this is the denoising that was used here, and that looks fine, unless you're blowing it up really, really large. It's certainly okay for the print media and for display on your screen. And actually, that's mild denoising. So I'll now switch to Noise Ninja, which looks even better. And it really is excellent denoising. Don't know, of course, what's in these Canon cameras. I suspect it's something similar to a bilateral filter, which many of you know about. Let's analyze the noise just a little bit more. So standard formula for noise, it's the mean pixel value over the variation in that pixel value. It will be the photon flux multiplied by the exposure time, roughly, over the square root of that. And that's the variation due to the number of photons that arrive, what's called photon shot noise. Dark current, which leaks into the sensor, multiplied by how long it leaks in. And a read noise term, which is the noise introduced by reading off the voltage from the sensor. So the quick answer on sports photography is that you have to deal with the shot noise. That's what makes for most of your noise. Dark current's unimportant because the time is so short. And the read noise has been improving over the last decade. So that story is getting better. And because that's been improving, well, let's look at what has been happening because of that. So here's signal-to-noise ratio over the years. So the read noise has been getting better, but they've raised the number of megapixels each time to compensate for it. So the noise per pixel has been doing this, which means it's actually been getting slightly worse, and I think we've all noticed that on cameras. However, at the same time, display resolutions have not risen as fast as megapixel on sensor. And so you're typically averaging pixels down for the display you're going to make. And once you consider that, because noise goes down as the square root of the number of pixels you average together, things have been getting better. And so as a result of that, you can use higher ISOs than you could 5 or 10 years ago. And as an example, here's a picture taken by Michael Cass on what's probably the most sensitive camera that a consumer can buy, which is the D3S at ISO 3200. And here's one at ISO 6400. It's been denoised, but it looks great. Here's one that Fredo Duran took at ISO 25000. So he said it was too dark to read the menu in this restaurant when he took this picture, which means it didn't look like this to him, which is actually kind of an interesting question by itself. Let's see, did it look maybe like this? This is what the viewfinders do when you, on little point-and-shoot cameras, when you say, I like to bracket. They just darken it like this. But that's actually not the right answer. That doesn't look very natural, does it? How about something like this? Put a human adaptation curve in it. That's probably more like what it looked like to Fredo. So that brings up kind of interesting side question about the future of these cameras. Those of you who have an SLR know that there's a little button for depth of field preview. Well, that's not what future cameras should have. Why don't they replace that button with something that does this on the electronic viewfinder? So that you can either see the bright view so that you can compose the silly shot, or you can look at this view so that you see, you look at this view so that you can see the mood that you would get out of the photograph, and that would be the little button. Or maybe the button should be right next to the viewfinder. Rick?
Is this human adaptation, is that what people sometimes call scotoscopic vision?
Scotopic vision?
Scotopic vision.
I try to remember what curve I threw at this in a quick hack. It doesn't go that far.
Okay.
But even within photopic vision, if you fall below a certain threshold, the contrast is suddenly increased. Painters have known this for 500 years, and so they'll drop the shadows into complete blackness as a way of telling the viewer of a painting that the scene is very dark. And that's essentially what I've done. Okay, frame rate and burst size. So here's the most recent of the Canon sports cameras. And I am guessing, I don't know, that the frame rate is limited by the readout rate, which is a 16 megapixel sensor, 10 frames per second is their burst rate, 16-bit pixels, and that is the speed of reading off the sensor. The mirror flip and the shutter reset may also be limiters. I suspect they're balanced with that readout rate. By the way, the shutter life is only about 150 games. Scared my sports photographer friends when I worked that out for them. The burst size is limited by the writing to the card. So I can only do 28 RAWs before it begins to slow down, just because of the amount of RAM that's available, or more JPEGs. All right, so 10 frames per second. What can you do in sports photography with 10 frames per second? So here's men's water polo, and we're at 0 seconds and 1/10 of a second, and missed it. So 10 frames per second is not fast enough for many sports. Now, some people look at the sequence and they say, are you sure that's a burst? And the answer is, I think so, but I'm actually not completely sure, because bursts are not identified on cameras these days. My friends at Adobe complain bitterly to me about this. That means that they can't gather together these pictures and call them a first-class data object, because they're not sure that it's a burst. The clock stamp that's in the EXIF file is not accurate enough. Here's another example that I know is a burst. So 0, 1/10 of a second, they're about to head a soccer ball. Arg. So that was definitely a miss. So another interesting aspect of this is that motion estimation optical flow is just not going to work. Look how much difference there is. Look at her legs, for example. You're not going to do optical flow between those two frames. No way. So at a Dagstuhl workshop on computational video that I attended in October, I asked a whole bunch of computer vision researchers what they would most like to see in computational video. And they said, faster frame rates, because they want the motion to be 1 pixel per frame, so that the brightness constancy assumption of optical flow works, where it really becomes a gradient calculation.
Let me ask the obvious question. You're showing this to us on a monitor that's 1024 by 768. Why weren't you shooting high-def video, which is 1080p, right? Wouldn't we be done? because you're not blowing this up to print. You know, you're just, if it's going to show up on a web page, then isn't 1080p good enough on your SLR?
That's an interesting question. You're often cropping, so you might want about twice that.
Okay.
The second thing is that the cameras that do still photography and video are subsampling. And so their video is not optimal quality. It's not like the Red One, for example. They're subsampling. They're dropping pixels. Yes, they're dropping pixels. There are lots of websites I can point you to that prove that they're dropping pixels. You know, they'll take the Fresnel zone plates and they'll shoot them. You ever tried picking up one of those things? You wouldn't want to run around a sports arena with one of those, with all of its lenses. They're not meant for sports photography.
But just for fun, next time you go out shooting this kind of event, just take little bursts of HD video and see how bad it is.
Right. I think, as I'll show in a couple of slides, I think that the burst rate and the video rate will essentially merge at some point. That's Moore's law will do that for us. And then you're right and I'm right and the whole problem will kind of go away. One thing you might at least be able to do is adjust the shutter speed in the next frame based on the motion blur that's in the current frame. All right, so this heading of the soccer ball, could you nail it using some computational photography? Detect the ball, detect the faces, trigger when they're close so you can get a shot like this that my colleague Hector Garcia Molina got. So one of the problems with your solution is, all right, so on current cameras you couldn't do it because you'd have to detect this and do the prediction from low-res frames. And that's hard. If the cameras were faster, we could capture the burst and save the decisive shot. When are you going to do that? Or are you just going to capture all the video and make all the saving decisions later? In other words, just take a video of the entire game.
But if you know that the event, the header happens once every minute or so, and you're pretty sure the action is stopped, you can go back and scrub, you know, and take that shot out right then, and then throw it in the video. So
you're saying the sports photographer would capture some bursts.
There's always a buffer of sorts, right?
Right. But they probably can't take the time then to decide it. So they'll just have to store all the, yeah. No, I think that is going to be plausible in the future once you can get to a higher frame rate.
It says save the last 5 seconds.
Right, right. Yeah, I think, of course, then you have to think about the writing speeds and so on, because then they can't use the camera for the next couple of seconds. But I think Moore's law will fix that. So Rick asked me to throw in a few slides about the Stanford Frankencamera and this kind of a scenario, which seems plausible to program into a camera, seems as good a place as any. So here's a quick tangent on the Stanford Frankencamera. So we have been building platforms to try and explore this idea of programmable cameras. We built 2 reference platforms for our architecture, a big ugly thing whose only redeeming characteristic is that it takes standard Canon lenses. It's based on a Texas Instruments system on a chip. And the same underlying software architecture we have implemented on a Nokia N900 where we've replaced the software stack. And the whole idea was to try and make control of the camera programmable so that it could facilitate research in experimental computational photography and also so that I and others could teach courses. So in my computational photography course last winter, we handed out one of these to every student, and assignment number 1 was replace the autofocus algorithm on this camera, because this has a movable lens. And we're going to grade you not only on how accurately you can focus on a scene, but how fast in milliseconds. So it's a very fun assignment for the students to try and come up with the fastest accurate autofocus algorithm. And 2 of the students came up with algorithms that were better than Nokia's. And so we went back to Finland and presented those algorithms. And it's not like I have a class of particularly brilliant students, but there aren't competitions like this that are done regularly. It's not something that academicians study in that are in textbooks. This stuff is all proprietary. And so I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in this area if we can make cameras programmable. And then I think I've already made that point of the proving ground for plugins and apps. Here is the architecture. The key insight we had is that in order to be able to vary parameters quickly on a burst of photographs, which is one of the common modes of computational photography these days, what you need is, instead of a sensor that says change it to a 30th of a second, now take a shot, because you can't do that at a very high rate because there's a pipeline of frames going through. You need a pipeline of requests where each request says, when you get around to it, take a shot at 30th of a second. Then take a shot at a 60th of a second. And make sure I know which ones they are when they come back. And so they'll come back to the application processor time-stamped with a frame ID and their exposure time or any other setting parameters. It's such a small change, but it's absolutely key to being able to do a burst with varying parameters. So it allows us to design an API that looks like this, where we declare a vector of bursts, and we set 2 different exposures. In this particular one, I asked it to fire the flash halfway through the first shot. And then I said, do these 2 in a loop, continuous loop, 1, 2, 1, 2, flash, no flash, flash, no flash. And then I can say get frame, and I'll be able to look at the parameters when it returns and know exactly which frame I'm getting. You can't do that with the SDK that's on an SLR camera these days. And so we programmed a bunch of applications with these. Here's one where David Jacobs, one of my PhD students, glued 2 flashes to the top of the ugly Frankencamera, making it uglier. Programmed one to strobe continuously, the other one to fire at the end of the exposure. Threw a bunch of playing cards up in the air and got this shot. What I like about this, aside from the shot's cool, is that he did this whole thing in an afternoon, from gluing the flashes onto the camera to getting this shot, because the platform enabled sort of wild, informal experimentation. So we're engineering a new version of this that will have an SLR quality sensor. The sensor on the current one is not so good. It'll be even bigger and uglier. Anyone can buy it. We have an NSF grant to make it free to US universities. It's not powerful enough for computational video or sports photography. So it's not going to be relevant to the stuff that I'm talking about in this talk. One interesting point, as long as I'm talking about this, if you look at the field of computer graphics, there are lots of courses, there are lots of textbooks, there are great conferences, there's a whole academic plenum of innovation that goes on in graphics. The same thing does not exist for photography. You can't open a single how-to book on photography and get the depth of field formula. They're not in the books. They'll tell you rules of thumb on depth of field, but the formula is not there, and it's a really simple formula with a few things in the numerator and a few things in the denominator. You have to go to an optics monograph to find them. There are not courses taught at universities on the technical aspects of photography. I'm trying to do one at Stanford, but I'm sort of alone in this, and there are no good textbooks that I can use. We need to build a whole new plenum of engineers that are trained on the technical aspects of photography, that are publishing in conferences, and that are building up a body of intellectual property that is more open, that lets people experiment more, that lets people build camera pipelines, more like the graphics community is now. And this may take a generation. This is not going to happen overnight. Okay, soapbox mode off. Back to sports photography. Next variable, focus. Okay, so this is a well-focused shot. One of my favorite lacrosse players. And if we zoom in, that's in critical focus. Given the anti-aliasing filter on the sensor, that's the best we can do. Okay, so depth of field is an issue. Her eye's in focus, her hair's not. So it may look to you in focus, but if we zoom in, we can see that it's not. We can actually run this depth of field formula that I said is not in any how-to book on photography. There it is. It's not very complicated. F4, the circle of confusion is the size of a pixel, let's say. The distance to the subject is 50 feet. It's a 300 millimeter lens, 1.3 crop factor. And the depth of field is 6 inches. So that much is in focus. That's not very much. That's basically not even her head. And so her hair is out of focus. A little bit different on this video projector, which is at a lower resolution. But I've shown you the insets so that you see that it's really not in focus. So depth of field is demanding at these low F numbers and high magnification. So extended depth of field becomes interesting. Getting the right focus becomes interesting. Depth of field is, of course, useful for isolating one player from their background. Here are lots of shots that just wouldn't be the same without shallow depth of field. This shot would be useless without shallow depth of field because of the cluttered background. Sometimes you'd like a little bit more depth of field so that all of the Stanford players would be in focus. It's different from the problem of fixing misfocus. I'll come back to that. But remember, we can't just stop down the aperture because we're almost always fighting for photons. This is a night game, so I'm definitely fighting for photons here. So how do these cameras do focus? It's a phase-based autofocus. They actually have micro lenses and they make two little images at each focus square and then compare the locations of those little micro images to see when they line up. And the way an SLR does focus, based on the displacement between these two little images that are essentially seen from the left and right aperture, sides of the aperture, they can predict exactly how much they need to move the lens in order to go in focus. And so in a single motor motion, they can go almost right to the correct focus, as opposed to your point-and-shoot camera, which uses what's called contrast-based autofocus, where it has to hunt and peck, and that's why it takes longer.
Sorry, Mark, I've never heard this explanation before. So
oh, sorry.
Micro lenses?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I had some slides in my standard course talks. There's no whiteboard. Oh, there is. So there's a lens, and then there's the reflex mirror that goes up to the viewfinder, but there's a partially transparent part in the middle of it, and that goes back to another mirror that points that beam down, and it points it down to pairs of micro lenses, one for each focus spot. And the pairs of lenses make two little images, typically 1D, but they might be more than 1D. And then if you have one bright spot, you'll get two little pulses here. And the relative locations of those pulses tell you the depth. It's a little light field. That's called phase-based autofocus. There's a nice Wikipedia page on it that points to an applet that we wrote for our course that has a little animation. You can play with it.
Okay, thank you.
But you can, from looking at the phase, you can tell it exactly where to go very, very fast. So all the professional cameras, in fact all SLRs, have this phase-based autofocus. One typically uses only the center focusing spot because otherwise you'll get peripheral characters. And it was lucky here, and she's nicely focused. Of course, your subjects are not always centered. So what a real pro will do is they'll maybe look at the previous person who went over and press the manual autofocus button. They will focus just when they say to autofocus. And then it won't focus anymore, and then they'll wait for the next person to go over the bar. I'm not good enough to do that. That takes years of experience to be able to press that button at just the right time. For example, if there's going to be a shot on goal in a hockey game or something like that, you have to be really, really well practiced to do that. So I didn't do it in mine. And this kind of thing happened a lot. So what is that focused on? Well, it's focused on the grass. Now that's silly. Why is it focused on the grass? Why can't we have a little switch, a little plug-in, a little menu that prohibits focusing on the grass? The grass is green, maybe it's got a certain texture, or maybe I ask it to only focus on moving objects, which of course you have to be careful because you may pan the camera. But there are things you could do with a little bit of computation to improve your odds on focusing. So here's another situation. I missed that shot. There's the one I got, which is useless. So could I use some of the information from the sharp shot to fix the blurry shot? Rick is shaking his head. No, really? I thought that's what you guys do in your group, isn't it?
Yeah, very.
It's hard. But suppose it was just a little bit out of focus. Non-local means, there might be some way to help, not as much as the one that I showed. That was an extreme example. And you could even imagine it being used in casual photography. If you take a whole burst of pictures, if you're capturing for a second, you've got 30 frames, you have every part of the scene that you're interested in focus if you've moved your lens in the right way. You've got to be able to use some of that to help you improve something that's out of focus when they finally smile and you press the shutter. Let's not even have the shutter button half press do anything. As soon as I bring the camera up to my eye, gyros, accelerometers, start capturing images and use that for useful things. Then the half press is a placebo. And when you do the full press, it just captures the composition you were interested in. Let's go back and look at it again. So something else to note here, same two shots. It ought to know this is the right moment and then this is not, because this is a soccer ball here. So why don't we have a plugin called Soccer Ball Focus? Going down to shoot your daughter's game, make sure you load that up into your camera before you go down there on a Saturday afternoon. Trainable before the game to allow for unusual balls. You could also use it to set the white balance and exposure. Because there's a calibration object. Until it gets dirty, it's a pretty good calibration object. You can even imagine a pre-game warm-up for cameras where you photograph all the players, the ball, and then you adjust it so that you get the hyperfocal distance between the player and the ball in this case. And use it to adjust the depth of field. So I'm glossing over a lot of things here. This is not so easy. Courtney Verlew, let's see, is that her? With a half shadow across her face? Is that her in 3/4 view? Most face detection or recognition algorithms will fail on this. Maybe face detection will succeed, but recognition certainly wouldn't. Might be the referee. You don't care about the referee. Maybe players should carry wireless chips. And there are a number of experiments going on in a number of companies to do exactly that. That may be the answer for this. Here's an example I like. #1 collegiate player last year in the United States. She happened to be from Stanford. And she has a very changeable face. You'll never recognize that automatically. Of course, sometimes she's from the back. But then you might be able to recognize her number. OK. Auto-misfocusing. What else goes wrong? There's that center focus square. It caught the background. OK, can't we fix this computationally? How about prohibiting focusing beyond a certain distance? Now, it's a little bit tricky because fields are rectangular and you move around. But that's not rocket science. GPS, other ways of knowing where you are, triangulation. And don't focus beyond the boundaries of the field unless you press a special button or turn off that mode. It's never what you want. And that would solve that problem. I'd be remiss if I didn't at least mention the idea of the Plenoptic camera. So I shot the Stanford Cal Big Game last year with a Canon 50D that had a micro lens array built into it, courtesy of Refocus Imaging. It was a prototype. And so let's see if this works. OK, so there's a shot I took, not quite full resolution. And we're focused on the Stanford team. But if I really want to focus on the Cal team, I can do that after the fact. And I could even focus on this guy in the back with a funny microphone trying to pick up what's going on before they snap the ball. This is enough resolution, again, for print photography, for print media and for most applications of photography. And you can fix the focus after the fact. So
Could you then combine those all together and get the entire shot in focus?
Oh, you could create a focal stack and then use an all-focus algorithm. Yes. Those are not necessarily completely robust, but they're often robust. So there is a loss in spatial resolution when you put these micro lenses behind, but it doesn't have to be as much as many of the papers that have, the academic papers about micro lens-based refocusable systems. For example, in a case like this, if we had an 18 megapixel sensor, we might only need 4 by 4 pixels behind each micro lens. So a relatively modest loss of spatial resolution, still giving us more than enough resolution for most applications and enough Z refocusing for the line of scrimmage in a football game. So shots that could have been saved with a modest amount of refocusing. This is almost well focused. The ball's in perfect focus, but she's a little bit out of focus. Just a little bit of extended depth of field would have been enough to save this shot. This could have used a bit more on the ball there. This a little bit on his toes. There are lots of other extended depth of field techniques that could be used here. Some shots could use a tilted focal plane because of the perspective here. And my app, SynthCam, allows tilted focal planes. So this is one I took with my iPhone app, where is a tilted focal plane that runs through the figures. So I put 4 points there, and there, and then solve for a homography that runs a focal plane through those figures. That's compared to a non-focal plane shot. All right, last few things. What else goes wrong in sports photography? Meaningless backgrounds often happen. There's really nothing you can do except find another vantage point. He's not going to land on the ground. There's a pool underneath him. Cluttered backgrounds are very common, especially indoors. It's depth of field helps a little bit. It doesn't completely solve the problem. Even here on outdoor shots. So this is not the original. I fiddled with this one. Here's the original. And so this took a while, actually, to darken and desaturate the background. It would be nice, for example, if I had a focus-based region selector in Photoshop. Why isn't there a focus-based selector? Just outline all the stuff that's sharp. That doesn't seem very hard. That would enormously help for things like this. Okay, conclusions. A lot of aspects of sports photography are intrinsically hard. As Rick and I discussed, faster bursts of videos could help if they're of good quality. A lot of this is going to need specialized hardware. So the FCAM API for the Frankencamera that I talked about a little bit earlier is an API for controlling cameras. That's really only one of two abstractions that we need to work on for programmable cameras. The other is an abstraction for the image processing, so that below that abstraction, hardware vendors can continue to innovate in accelerations, GPU, VPU, where V is vision, PPU, where P is photography. And above that abstraction, developers can write these plugins for cameras. And we're working on such an abstraction at Stanford. You could call this camera shaders instead of graphics shaders, if you'd like. And that needs to be done. Camera's a light field probe. Why is there even a notion of frames in photography? Isn't that kind of left over from the film era? When you point a camera, it should be gathering photons, but it doesn't necessarily have to gather frames. It could be looking at interesting little sections. The Frankencamera F3 will have region of interest capabilities. You could even, the Frankencamera F3 will also have non-destructive read back, so that you could read a little window, decide, it's not near saturation yet. I'll come back and read that window again in another few milliseconds. I'll go back and play with some of the other parts of the image. Okay, now it's time to read that same window again without having cleared it in between. So you can imagine that it's just gathering photons, resetting parts of the chip randomly. And I think that could be a future direction for sensor camera systems, frameless photography. And of course, one hopes that this might lead to new art forms, new kinds of sports photography. And I think a lot of the plugins that we see in the iPhone and the Android market are already doing that. They're letting people experiment with ways of taking pictures that they couldn't have done before. Parting thoughts. Good photographers make it look easy. It's not to get shots like this. I was surprised how rough sports are. You know what's going on here? I hear that sometimes with their feet they also take off their bathing suit, if they can. I wouldn't want to be in the way of her. I had fun doing the whole project. There are lots of other things worth photographing there. And with that, I'll thank you for your attention and be happy to answer any questions. Can we turn the lights back on?
One thing you can do on purpose with this.
Michael.
Is there anything in sports photography and all these things you're talking about that doesn't really just apply directly to more casual photography?
Oh, I think a lot of it
Maybe except
does.
for, instead of needing 10,000th of a second, maybe 1,000.
Yeah, and a lot of it does. It'd be easier to do. This was just a nice domain I could put a box around and quantify how much we need to fix the problems in that domain. But yes, I think a lot of it is applicable. Yeah.
You said 2,000 shots a game. Back in the film days, what was your average sports photographer?
That's a really good point. They had to be a lot luckier in those days. And that's why you see more amazing sports photography these days than you did in the film era. Yep, that's exactly right. And also, the digital cameras now are, frankly, more sensitive than a film camera. So I can shoot at ISO 6400 in an arena and still shoot at 1,000th of a second. Couldn't do that with a film camera. Not with one whose film grain you want to look at anyway.
What is the trend to the ISO?
Sorry?
What is the trend to the ISO sensibility? What is the end? How do I see? Is there a kind of Moore law to the ISO trend?
Well, read noise is decreasing. That's why we've seen the improvement. Eventually, a shot noise is a given. So eventually you run out of things that you can do because of shot noise. There's just randomness in the number of photons that arrive. I don't know how, I guess we're closer to that for we're closer to that, we're essentially in that regime already for some kinds of shots, depends on the shot. That will happen at some point. I don't know how close we are.
Expectations changing and what impresses us and before. Because previously, if I imagine 20, 30 years, what was the encounters or something else, now everybody goes and takes that kind of photograph. So in sports or other, it's a somewhat random question, but I'm curious if we are expecting a lot more.
Right. Well, so one thing, it would be impressive if more people could take those kinds of pictures. And a lot of people kind of give up them when they're in the stands. They give up on trying to capture the action. They know they can't. But if their camera were more powerful, maybe they could. So that would be compelling to the average consumer. But as far as the professional goes, it would mainly improve their odds. And therefore, they could capture more things that are slipping by now, like the heading of the soccer ball. Yeah.
I wonder if it would, a lot of the burst shots that you were showing, between one shot and the next, you're just going to lose the shot that you want. And so one of the solutions you mentioned was to say, okay, well, we'll just be recording the whole time, and then when you snap the shutter, you'll take that composition.
But as we said, it better be at more than 10 frames per second, or you may still miss it.
So would it help in framing the problem to say, okay, I know there's a shot coming up, and start recording then, and then,
right.
Instead of retrodicting what the shot was, saying, I'm pretty sure the ball's going to come into frame pretty soon.
Right.
Does that simplify the problem statement?
Well, that's essentially what a sports photographer does already. They know that the soccer ball is about to head, so they just press the button and it goes. Okay. But it has to do that more than 10 frames per second. That's what I did in those cases. Still missed it.
So when it comes to autofocus, are the SNR manufacturers starting to do this already with computational photography? Because Nikon has autofocus modes that are like 3D tracking and autofocus area on your cameras. Is that kind of what they're moving towards?
Well, they are doing it, as you say. They do predictive tracking, for example. And photographer enthusiasts will run tests or judge what happens when someone's running straight at the camera. Will the focusing predict it, and so on. And we're seeing more of that go down into the point-and-shoot cameras as well. A higher fraction of the shots you take with point-and-shoot cameras are coming out well because of things like that. So that is happening already.
Yeah, maybe I've tried 3D tracking, but it never seems to work out well for me in my sports photography.
When you say 3D tracking,
Nikon camera has a mode. My D90 has a mode for 3D tracking for autofocus.
What is 3D tracking mean?
I think the idea is I can follow someone moving around.
Predictive tracking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Never seems to work
And these
quite
cameras
well.
definitely do that. Yeah.
At the beginning of your talk, you mentioned this disconnect between camera manufacturers and the internet ecosystem.
Right.
So I don't know how many cameras, how many lenses are typically looking at one field during one game, but is there something you could leverage about this communal, I don't know, taking the picture of the same thing from multiple perspectives and sending it somewhere and doing something in the cloud to
Right. So there have been experiments. So Takeo Kanata for the Super Bowl once did this thing with a whole ring of cameras. People talked about at Obama's inauguration, if everyone could take a picture at the same time with all their cell phones and then talk to each other in various ways, they could get a great light field fly around. I think it's certainly possible to do these kinds of crowd-sourced photography or collaborative photography things. And I think it's a very fruitful area. So that was another project that some of the students in my class did, where they got two cameras to work together and they did stereo, or they use one as the flash for the other so that you get rid of red eye by having off-camera flash. And there are lots of possibilities there. But you've got to get the camera industry to embrace these technologies. You know, I'll tell you an anecdote. I had a top camera maker whose name I'll leave unsaid come into my laboratory, and we tried to sell them on this whole idea of sandboxing off part of their chip to allow plugins and things like that. And they said, well, what happens if someone takes a bad picture with one of these plugins? They might bring the camera back to the store for warranty repair. Cultural mismatch. You know, if an app crashes on this, I don't blame Apple. I know who wrote the app. They just don't get it. And that may be an opportunity for the mobile manufacturers. It may be a generational change that's required. Yeah.
So related to the last question a little bit, it seems like a lot of these stadiums are pretty heavily instrumented already, like the line of scrimmage that we see on television.
1st and 10 or something like that?
Yeah, 1st and 10.
Right.
And there's all sorts of sort of stuff that they layer on top of the video feed.
Right.
Do you think there's any opportunities there to open up that information about, open up this data about the stadiums and about the sports field and where the sports field
Open it up to who?
Just to the community. Is that another input potentially to take better pictures?
I guess if they wanted, from an economic point of view, to empower either their competitors or the consumers in the stands. I guess you could get a premium ticket. And the ticket comes with a Wi-Fi connection that gives you the 3D model of the field so that you can take better pictures. No, that's a possibility. There might be an economic model there. That'd be fun. Yeah.
Why the trick you explained, why isn't that used for autofocusing in video mode, for example, in the 5D Mark II?
Why isn't this?
Yeah.
Right, so in video mode, this mirror is flipped up out of the way. And so this mirror is flipped up out of the way as well.
Oh, it is also.
That's right. And so the light is just going back to the sensor, which is back here, and then you have to use contrast-based, which means that it goes like that, and it takes a long time, and it's terrible for fast-moving things. So the new mirrorless cameras, some of them have something here that's always in place, that's partially transparent, and that still reflects some light down and allows phase-based focusing, even though the sensor is still active. So that's an interesting compromise solution. And we're going to see a lot more games of that sort.
So the mirrorless design loses some light if
Yes.
the project's darker, the sensor's darker.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. But it allows phase-based autofocus, which means immediately go to the right place instead of hunting around. So shape from defocus versus shape from focus. Well, shape from... No, never mind. Not a good analogy.
Just, Anoop's question was more about the sort of ecosystem and who's taking photographs. I think there's a difference between professional matches or, you photographing Stanford because you like the team, and the amateur matches which have parents and children, right? Because there's a big incentive for lots and lots of people to be photographers, right?
Mm-hmm.
In the professional situation, it's the shot. There's just one thing that's interesting. And so the more you can kind of make people want to go out and shoot from the stand, so to speak, in those situations, the more people will buy newer technology.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yep, I agree. And one of the limitations is your viewpoint is fixed, of course.
That's true. Yep.
You're in your seat. But yeah, I still think it could be done a lot better than it is now.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Mark.
Okay.